Thank you all so much for coming. We won't be having a Q&A today because of COVID protocols. So Dawn and I are just going to be talking, and we hope we touch on a lot of things that you're thinking about.
Absolutely. So much fun.
So, Dawn, we have been friends for
a long time.
A long time. We're not going to say how long, huh?
Yes.
So, and I feel like after reading this fantastic book that I am just beginning to understand you.
Oh my God.
So, this book is so honest and it's actually fearless. And she has revealed so much about her life that she even reveals secrets that her mom didn't even know.
That's true.
And while we're talking about family, I know that several members of her family are here today. Dawn, would you like to introduce who's here and ask them to stand up and say hello?
I mean, I know that my daughter Hannah is here, and hi, she just waved. And I'm certain that there are other family members. So you just wave, and that's good enough.
Is Miss Barber here?
Is who?
Miss Barber.
No, she's not here.
Are we sure? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Miss Barbara, your mom, is prominent throughout this book,
Yes.
of course.
Yes.
Has she read it yet?
No. My mother was in lockstep with me at every juncture, and so she has not read the book, but she knows what's in it. Now, it's not the same because she doesn't necessarily have all the context, but she's definitely prominent. Her voice, it's hard to diminish that voice. She is that quintessential Black mom who has an opinion about everything, who has power over everything. And whether she lets you know that or not, or so it's not something that you are always immediately aware of. But yeah, she totally controls my life still.
So before we get started, Dawn, why don't you give us a little overview of what this book is about?
Okay, so Three Girls from Bronzeville is the story of three girls who start out in a very similar place with similar aspirations and wind up taking three spectacularly different paths. My sister Kim, my best friend Deborah, and I were coming of age in the afterglow of the civil rights movement. It was a moment when our parents believed that this country would finally be amenable to offering us the opportunities that it had denied generations of Black folks. Now, our parents would quickly be disabused of that, but in that moment, they saw futures for us that were supposed to be robust and filled with so much promise. We were going to college, we were going to have great paying jobs, and we were going to become homeowners and partake of every aspect of the American dream. For Kim and Deborah, that dream would prove to be elusive, and they were the loves of my life. They were my first great loves. And I set out to understand what happened. When did we lose them? And that became the motivating force of the book.
So, one of the questions I want to start out with is, this book is so personal, and it is not just your story,
right,
but it's the story of all the people who were and still are a part of your life,
yes.
Right? How did you prepare Hannah, your mom, and of course Deborah, for what was going to come?
Well, first of all, you have to be somewhat delusional to write maybe any book, but especially a memoir. And I wasn't exactly prepared myself for what was to come, because I am a journalist. I've been a journalist for a long time, and I've written novels, but there's nothing like turning the lens on yourself. And so I think that what I had to do was start with the overview. There are two girls, there are three girls. One will die, one will go to prison, and the third one will tell the story. And so I started with just the broad strokes, and I wanted to figure out what happened. And so initially, I looked at everything that I had. I had years and years of correspondence, decades actually of correspondence from Kim and from Deborah. I had diary entries. I had hundreds and hundreds of pages of court documents. And so that was the journalist in me, looking at the evidence, looking at the papers in front of me. And then it wasn't until I started to really, really dig, I also began to interview people. And what I learned from the interviews, it was very much an investigation, trying to challenge my memory, because as we all know, memory is fallible. And sometimes memory is not anywhere close to the truth, especially if it's a story that's been handed down over and over again. And so as I started to talk to people, I learned a lot. But it wasn't until I got to the very painful parts of the story, when my sister died, trying to understand how she died, that I mean, there were chapters that I had to write, I would write with friends, meaning I'd spent a weekend with a friend or something, because I didn't want to be alone revisiting some of those moments. What we do in life is, especially with tragedies, we pack them up. We put them in the far reaches of the closet, and we just leave them. We move on. But then to go back and get that stuff and look at it, I'm so glad that I did it, but at the time, as you know, there were times when I would call you, Dahleen Glanton, and say, who said I could do this? Somebody has paid me to write a book. They've given me a portion of the advance. I got to write a book or give these people this money back. and so you just press on. I mean, sometimes it feels like you're walking up a hill, up a mountain, and then there are times when it feels like you're sliding down a hole, and you're just trying to claw your way out of it. Mm-hmm. But that is the process. And I don't know that I've listened to people who have written memoirs, and I don't know that it's any different from for any of us, where you just, you don't start out thinking you're going to get so personal. But I did believe that I wanted this to be a story about three girls. And there was no way, and first I have to say that my editor did push me, because I did have initially more about my sister and Deborah than about me. And so, but it wasn't that I didn't intend to, it's just that there's so much stuff. You're under an avalanche of material that you have to work your way to making sure that there is equal time. So that was the thing that I wanted to make sure that that if I told a story about them that was intimate, I didn't want to leave myself out of it because it didn't feel fair.
And that's a really interesting point, Dawn. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about Miss Barbara because, first of all, I just love her to death. She's one of my favorite people. That's Dawn's mother, of course. And I can hear her saying, she's one of these people, she's very private. She's like, I'm not putting my business out in the street.
That's exactly my mom.
Type of person, that's who she is. So how do you decide in a situation like this? Which stories are yours to tell?
That's exactly right. Yeah, and that's when I had to go to my mom and say, is it okay to tell this story? Because my parents divorced when I was very young. I was 7 years old. And the reason that they divorced is something that's very personal to her. I mean, it's part of my story, but it's not necessarily my story to tell, and especially not to publish. And so I said to her, every time I got to a part of the book where I thought there was something that could be incredibly sensitive, I said, okay, Mom, can I tell this story? And she said, yeah. But I think sometimes some of this is a part of, she's 85 years old. And she wouldn't mind me saying this because she doesn't look 85.
Not at all.
But I think that there's a point which, now maybe 40 years ago, I I wouldn't have been telling this 40 years ago. I would have been too young. But years ago, maybe she would have said no. But now there's a little bit more, latitude or flexibility, and maybe there's also this need to have the record show something and have it documented. And so she was completely open to it. And I would read her portions, the same with Deborah, because again, this is Deborah's story. And I mean, my sister does not get to, to speak for herself. But what I did want is my mother to read the passages about Kim, because that was really important, that maybe my sister have a voice through my mother. But it's very, it's one thing for me to have told just my story, but you're right, it becomes much more complicated when you're telling everybody else's business too. Right.
And we're glad that she did. We're glad that everybody agreed to say, okay, put it all out there. We'll just deal with it. So we've talked a lot about how this memoir is a story of American life, specifically African American life. And the characters may be different in every home, the scenarios are different, but I just felt like it was a story, it was my story too, I saw myself in you growing up as a 13, 14, 15-year-old.
Right.
So the question is, how important was it for you to show readers that African American families often represent a different kind of normal that is very different from the stereotypes that we see and the expectations that the general public has of what family life should look like?
One of the most gratifying things so far with this book, the book has only been out in the world about a month, but I've been hearing from a lot of Black women who say, I see myself in Deborah, Kim, or even me, or they see themselves as a combination of us. But what you and I should say is that you grew up in the South.
Yes.
And I grew up in the
Very
North.
different environments.
Yeah, and a few years apart. But what's interesting is that, remember, we wrote this piece years and years ago in the Chicago Tribune, and it was a perspective section piece. And I don't know what motivated the story, but we wrote a story talking about how different, years apart, how different we were, the North and South, but also the similarities. And so my story is a story about people, but it's also a story about place. It was really important for me to write about Bronzeville, which is the cradle of Chicago's Great Migration. My great-grandparents came to Chicago during the first wave of the Great Migration, fleeing the ravages of the Jim Crow South. And they came here and they hoped Chicago was going to be heaven. And of course, it initially seemed that way in the beginning, but it did not remain that way, because what happened was they forced so many people, so many new migrants into this narrow strip of land that it was initially called the Black Belt, and then that area began to press eastward, and it expanded, but it was still too many, the density was still too much, too many people in too small of a place. And so what happened? You get what you get when that happens. The institutions stopped working, so the garbage pickup lagged. Whenever there was a street light blown out, it was not replaced in the proper amount of time. There were just all of these, there was a lot of decay. Landlords abandoned their buildings. First of all, they chopped them up into kitchenette apartments, and so people were just living in these just horrible conditions. And yet, we did, as my grandmother would say, we found a way to take a bunch of scraps and we stitched together a world. And so you were able to have Ida B. Wells, who lived in Bronzeville, the first, the anti-lynching journalist and activist. You were able to have Gwendolyn Brooks, who lived in Bronzeville, who was the first Black person to win the Pulitzer Prize. And Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, a Black man, a heart surgeon, who was the first surgeon to perform the first successful heart surgery. You had Louis Armstrong and all of these just amazing, the Tommy Dorsey, the godfather of gospel music, started there in Bronzeville. So in terms of, but you also had redlining, the 1930s policies of redlining. You also had restrictive housing covenants. And even when the Supreme Court in the 1940s struck those policies down, you still had people who were still practicing, not selling their homes to blacks. And so you have all of this promise, but you also have decay. And that decay did not just end in the 50s or the 60s or 70s. We see a lot of the remnants of that today. And what I learned, and just to back up a little bit, we were coming of age in, as I said, after the Civil Rights Movement. And we were, part of our promise was our new housing apartment complex. It was built by a famous black dermatologist and John H. Johnson, the famed publisher. I mean, they were the architects of this idea where you would have, and what in the parlance of today it would be called affordable housing. So we were not at all wealthy. I mean, we were poor people, but our housing development was pristine. It was well kept. It was the lawns were well manicured. The playgrounds were just beautiful. And that was what we had. And so we had the dignity that is bestowed of, and it sounds like, it's not a small thing, but sometimes it may seem a little like, well, shouldn't everybody, be able to walk down streets that are clean? Shouldn't everybody be able to go up elevators that are just bright and shiny, and the stainless steel and the overhead panel just lights up, and you're zoomed up to these beautiful apartments? But we lived right across the street from the Ida B. Wells homes, a public housing project that had begun when we first moved in, begun its slide, but just a few years later, it was in full-on decay. And so what I saw firsthand was what it was like to go to school with kids who were living this subpar life. And so when we talk about today, I drive through communities that are just not functioning. They are so unhealthy, and we talk about food deserts, but there are hospital deserts. They are just, they are aspiration deserts. And that is what we see right now. And it didn't just start. This is something that has tentacles, back, that go way, way back. And it's always interesting to me when people say, well, wow, why do poor black people burn down their neighborhoods? Well, whenever there's an uprising or something, why does that happen? Well, when people feel like they have nothing to lose, they act that way. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but that is not a racial thing. That's something that transcends race. That if you have nothing to lose, you will live that way, like you have nothing to lose. What does it matter? A lot of these young men who don't even think about aging out beyond 20 and 21. And so I think that's one of the things that I wanted to say in the book as well, that there's so much of this stuff, the pathologies that are rooted in the past that we keep trying to figure out, well, how do we figure it out? And some of this starts with just giving people a decent place to live. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And treating them with dignity.
And that's very important, Dawn. One of the things that I think it's very clear in this book, even though you lived in Lawless, which was a community where people were expected to excel, and right across the street were people who not necessarily were expected.
Well, they were strivers, but they didn't have the same opportunities, right? I mean,
Right.
and that is because you can have all the expectations in the world, but if you don't have the tools to realize those dreams, then it becomes something, something completely different. And instead of you looking at expectations that are up here, you start to set your sights in a different place. Mm-hmm. And that was as I said, and then again, the reality is that there are no guarantees. There are no guarantees if you live in Kenilworth, mm-hmm. here in, on the Tony North Shore suburbs. There are just no guarantees, but the parents, especially, and I think about Kim, Deborah, mm-hmm. and me, mm-hmm. and because I know that our parents did the absolute best that they could. But you still try. That is the goal, to still try really hard.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was going to say also is that it's very clear in the book that your family understood this, yeah. right? And so there was not this attitude that we're better than the people across the
right.
street. And you talk about that
right.
at various points in the book. Your mom says that, and
right.
other people in your life say that. And the difference, I think, one of the things is that when you were coming along, it is very clear that you understood the history within that community where you were living.
We were told the history,
you were told
but I didn't.
The history.
I don't know that I mean, just like any kid, your given world is your given
yeah.
world, and you don't. It wasn't until I was like maybe in my 30s that I was like, Gwendolyn Brooks
yeah.
lived in my neighborhood, because you have to really read Gwendolyn Brooks,
yes.
and you have to understand it, and then you go like, oh my God, she was a genius, and she lived here. Yeah. So when you're a kid, I mean, yeah, we were told all of this stuff, but it kind of like, it's like another history lesson. Really, do we need this? But I think that the important thing is that my mother grew up in the Ida B. Wells homes. And that's one of the reasons why we weren't, but she grew up in a time when the Ida B. Wells homes was supposed to be the answer to the tenements. And so it was, in its beginning, it was this beautiful bastion of, they had gardens and just beautiful apartments, and everything was clean. And so, typically when you start there, I mean, even though it has changed, so she didn't tell us not to go across the street. Mm-hmm. And the reality is at that time, it was, we had friends from school. Now, there were a lot of parents in Lawless Gardens who did not send their kids to to the school to the elementary school where we attended. They went to private schools or parochial schools, or, even Deborah's parents took them out, and they went to a public school, but it was one of the better public schools, or considered one of the better public schools a few blocks away, and they had to use their grandmother's address. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that becomes kind of the class conflict. I mean, there's always this perception, because it's like, really? Yeah. But it was just the thing where they wanted to some people wanted to put up a wall. And we did. The managers of the housing complex did, after a while, as the project began to devolve. They put up a fence, and then initially it was a wire link fence, and then they took that one down as the project deteriorated, and put up a wrought iron one, and then closed off all of the other entrances. But it was that effort to
separate.
Right, to separate.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Let's talk about these women.
Okay.
In your life, and then we're going to talk about the men in her life, because there are some very interesting things that went on there. There was a lot of love in your family.
Yeah.
That's for sure. Your mom, of course, your Aunt Doris, mm-hmm. your grandmother. And in the book, you call them the flesh and blood, bricks and mortar. They were your fort.
Yes.
My favorite scene, and we're going to come back to what this scene is about later, but my favorite scene in the book is after there had been an incident with your mom and your dad, mm-hmm. and they were over there the next morning packing up his stuff
Yeah.
and getting it out of the house. I mean, Dawn, I could just imagine that.
They were the moving crew.
That's what you call the moving crew came in because this was not going to happen. When something happened to one of the women, it happened to everybody. I see you. I see you in those women too.
Yeah.
So, talk about the strength of these women and what they brought into your life.
Well, you know those women. Right?
I know these women.
You all know those women because we all have women who are, they are flesh and blood, but they are also your backbone. And that's how, and so the men in my life were very important, but the women, they radiated a different something that I was just attracted to, and I would just listen to them. When I was little, I would hide under the dining room table, and after dinner, they would stay at the table, my mother, my aunt, my grandmother, and sometimes they'd be visited by somebody else, but it was just the three of them, and so I'm under the table listening to them, and listening to their conversations, and they would often speak in euphemistic language, but, and as I got older, I started to catch on, but as a kid, it was just their storytelling. I mean, they would tell a story, and they were incredible storytellers, and they didn't get a chance to do what I do for a living, but they were far better at it than I was. I mean, the characters would be full-bodied, the pacing, the tempo, everything that they would say in a story. And I just love them. And they were also the type of women who I would tell one of them something, and they would tell the other two. And they would say, but don't tell her I told you. So look surprised. When she tells you, look surprised. And I knew it, but I would still, for some reason, I would say, okay, Auntie, don't tell Mama this. And then she'd be like, oh, baby, I'm not going to tell her a word. And she would say, be like verbatim, like she's taking notes so she could tell her. But that's who they were. And you knew that there were no secrets between the three of them. But they were just, and so that when my sister passed away, they were so devastated. But I think the reason why my mother could stand during that is because she had one on each arm. And that's just who they were. They were just, they were a force. Yeah. And they look so much alike. And now when I look at my mom sometimes, and she says this herself, she says she looks in the mirror sometimes and she'll say, hello, Mom, hello, sis. Because my aunt and my grandmother have passed on, but they look so much alike that it's really kind of scary.
And what a safety net for you.
Yeah.
Regardless of what was going on in the world
right.
around, there were these women who were
right.
always going to be there to catch you.
Because there's nothing like a black woman who says, baby, I'm praying for you. You know I'm praying for you, don't you? And I don't have to know all the details, but I just know. And that just, that is so comforting. And that's who they were. And still, my mother is the type of person who, I did some television show and I had my hair up, and she said, you shouldn't be wearing your hair up, not on television. And, it's like only my mother can say that, right? Anybody else can say that. And then I'm like, but for her, but then she's also the person I call whenever there's something. So you can have that person who will just tell you can't wear your hair up on television. But that is who she is. And I'm hoping that, and I felt like when I lost my sister, I gained other sisters. And I believe that we have that kind of dynamic where we have friends like, and I'm telling you, Marsha, because Dahleen and I said yesterday, we said that, well, Marsha will be fantastic just introducing us. And then we both said, but she's not going to do it. And when Marsha did it, we're like, what? Yay! But we have very different personalities. But when we come together, we just come together as, I think as a force.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there are lots of relationships like that with friends right. and relatives and so forth, so people can definitely relate to it. So there was also a lot of drama.
Yes.
in your life growing up. So I would tell you, there's a scene, and if you haven't read the book, I just don't know
Spoiler
how
alert.
to. I know. I don't know how to do this without talking about
That's okay.
this particular scene.
Right.
But there's a scene in the book where you're a young girl.
Mm-hmm.
You get up in the middle of the night and you walk into your mother's bedroom and you find her on the floor and your dad's hands are around her neck.
Right.
And you are devastated, of
Yes.
course, as a child. I will tell you, when I read that, I burst into tears. I wanted to get on the phone and call Miss Barbara and say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry that happened to you. What can I do?"
50 years ago it happened.
I know,
Right.
that long ago. You tell this story very early in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But it lays the groundwork for what we will learn about your relationship between you and your dad going
Right.
forward. Talk about a little bit about how that incident helped shape some of the things in your life as you move forward, and of course your relationship with your dad, at least for a while.
Right, right. Well, I mean, as I said, there are no real spoilers because you guys know that I just said that Deborah will go to prison. And so when people, I wrote about her in the pages of the Chicago Tribune, and when they would ask me, well, why, it's really good. No, they wouldn't necessarily ask. They would say, oh, it's so nice that you guys remained friends, or no, that I remained friends with her. That was the implication. And I'm like, well, you guys just don't know. You don't understand. Our story is such that Deborah rescued me. We became friends during a time when, it was after my father had left, and it was during a time when there was nothing, I'm sorry. Okay, cool. We became friends right after that, and she rescued my childhood. And I will never forget that. She lived in the apartment directly above mine. I'll go back a little bit. We met in the second grade, and I was this kind of, tall, lanky kid who was a little shy, and I would just watch her from afar because she was the prettiest girl in the school, and she was also the kid who misbehaved all the time. And so I was completely attracted to that. But in the second grade, I was the tallest kid in the class, and she was the shortest, and our worlds barely touched. But it wasn't until the third grade when we were seated across from one another because the teacher arranged us alphabetically. And so we were twice across from Turner. And we became friends. We realized we had so much in common. She too had one sibling, a sister, who was older, and mine was younger. And we found out that we had no idea we lived in the same apartment complex. We lived in a 24-story building, and out of all of those apartments, her apartment was directly above mine. We're like, how did that happen? But so after that trauma that I experienced with my father, and then the next day, the women becoming the moving crew, yes, moving him out, that I was afraid of everything. And Deborah helped me to recover. And my mother said that she loved Deborah because she rescued my childhood. Wow. And that, so she became, and so even though we did become, our paths started to diverge, maybe in adolescence, that we still, though, had a bond. And so years later, when she goes to prison, I'm like, you do what you do for a friend.
Right. And we're going to talk about Deborah some more as we move forward. But I also want to talk a little bit about these men.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah.
There were men who were in and out of your life in various ways throughout your growing up period. Some of them were really good men. At least one of them was an awful man.
Right.
But you didn't try to cover up their flaws.
Right.
You didn't try to paint them as saints either, but you were very honest about them, and you talked about what they brought into your life, various aspects of what they brought into your life. Why was it important in this book to point out the complexities of those relationships with those men? And
I want to say that the really, really awful man
Yes.
was a stranger.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't somebody I knew.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But the men in my life, it was very important to me to not paint them as, especially black men, as caricatures. They were, just like everybody else, complex human beings. My father, complex. My stepfather, complex. The men who who helped shape me were just incredible human beings. My stepfather, so after my mother and father divorced, my mother remarried a few years later. And my stepfather worked as a security guard at the downtown public library. And this behemoth of a building that had these gorgeous briny books. And he would ask me in the beginning what types of books did I want him to bring home. And initially, I was reading all of these books about these little white girls. So it was Pippi Longstocking, Trixie Belden, Nancy Drew. And after a while, he said, well, why don't we start introducing you to some other books? And so I began to read books by Carter G. Woodson, Langston Hughes, later on Maya Angelou. And so so he introduced me to myself. And I could see myself in these pages. My mother was the one who gave me Maud Martha, Gwendolyn Brooks's book. And I remember reading, and it was really cool to see, people who look like me. But then I read, I think it was on chapter 3, a street called Cottage Grove. And I said, Mom, we live near a street called Cottage Grove. And so it's not only people who look like me, but people who lived like me. And so all of these dimensions of the Black experience. But that was my stepfather, just had a ton of books, Richard Wright, and just reading, and not all of them, I couldn't understand all of them initially, and we would read some together. And sometimes Kim would sit in, or the family would read poetry or something, but he was an amazing reader. And then when I got to college, these men who were just fantastic in terms of, so I should say that I was put on this college track, and I was told from the very beginning that you need to go to college. And I wanted to go to college so bad, but after my freshman year, they invited me to leave because my grades were not very good. And I remember I was dating David Trice, whom I believe is here today. But I was dating him at the time, and I told him that I was just devastated when I got the letter, because they said the letter said, the dean said that I needed to sit out for a year, and then I could return. But it's very difficult to sit out for a year, because often students don't return. And I remember telling David, and he came and got me, and he drove me to his house. And his parents they lived in this beautiful home. And it was really one of my early experiences with the true Black middle to upper middle class. But his father was a senior vice president of an insurance company. And so the family just got in the living room, and they were just they were talking me through this letter. And I told Mr. Trice, I said, the dean said that this is non-negotiable. And he said, Dawn, everything is negotiable. And I just and David drove me back down to school a couple of days later, and the dean gave me a hard time, which I deserved. And he said, okay, sit out for a semester. And this was Dean Copeland, who was one of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign's first Black deans. And he was like, we get you down here and you go and just mess up. And I'm just sitting there, and I'm feeling like 2 inches tall. But he said, sit out for a semester. If you sit out for a semester and you bring your grades up, then we can talk about you returning. And a semester, there's a huge difference. There's a world between a semester and sitting out a year. And I did. I went to a community college for a semester, and I got my grades way up. Well, they couldn't have gone any lower. And I need to say that I was not partying. I was protesting. But we all, the partiers and the protesters who got kicked out, were in the same boat, so that didn't matter. So anyway, I mean, but Mr. Trice, who I would call, because I would marry his son, and I would call him Jim. He passed away last year at 94, and he was just an amazing father figure to me. There were other people other black men at the university who were just incredibly instrumental, but I do want to talk a little bit about my chapter about my father.
Okay, we're going to get to that.
Yeah, okay, so because I wanted to make sure, so we can...
Yes, we're definitely going to talk about your dad.
Okay.
So maybe we should talk about your dad now.
Okay.
First of all, I'm just going to say this. You told me that you think you're a much better person because your father didn't live in the house.
Yeah.
How is that?
Okay, Dahleen. I just think that my father was incredibly restrictive in a way that wasn't protective, but I think that I was able to have a broader view of the world because he was a little bit more confining, if that makes sense. And so I got a chance to do more with him not being in there. Because after the assault by the stranger on the lakefront, you also said you never told your dad. Oh no, my mother, because people again are complicated. So my mother was like, well, we're not going to tell your father because your father will try to kill that man. And her exact words were, there's no need in his ass going to jail. So we're just not going to tell him. So no, he never knew. So it was something that was really important for us to just keep it away from him. Mm-hmm. So it was really a very complicated relationship with your dad, right? Because the time you and Kim decided y'all were going to run away, right? Where did you end up going? You ended up going to him. My father, yeah. But the interesting thing is that he missed a lot of very important events in your life. He was not there for your graduation, your high school graduation, or your college graduation, or your wedding. That's right. Yet, there's a beautiful scene in this book where when you were very young and you had your tonsils removed, you woke up and who was in the hospital and who was sitting there? My father, reading the newspaper. Reading a newspaper. So, talk about this complicated relationship where clearly there is love on both sides. What is that? It's not just my family, but all relationships are complicated. Yes, and then they become more complicated when there's a divorce involved. And then people have to choose, are you team mom or team dad? Yeah. And we had to be team mom. If we were living with mom, we had to be, and that was very clear. There was never a moment when my father was not in my life. We didn't have access to him. Now, there were times when he just decided, okay, I'm not calling you. Now, if you call me, I'll answer, but I'm not calling. So my father worked as a manager, the night manager for a taxi company. And so we always knew where he was. It was just that kind of spiritually at times it was difficult to find him. And so my father, when I was in 2004, I was doing some research for a story. And my mother called me on my cell phone and told me that my father had had a heart attack. And I was just so surprised at how it affected me. Because I realized that if he had, because even when we would spend, I should say that my sister and I would spend weekends with him, like every other weekend with him. But he was never at home, so we spent more time with my stepmother, whom I absolutely, to this day, absolutely adore her. But we still didn't spend, my father was not a kid's person. He just wasn't. But anyway, so when he had the heart attack, I said that this is a moment that I need to get to know who he is. And so I started to spend my Friday nights at the taxi company, just interviewing him. And I couldn't do it as a daughter. I had to do it as a journalist. And so I took one of my Chicago Tribune notebooks and my pens, and I spent every Friday night from March of 24 into July of 24. And the only reason, 2004, the only reason why I left is because we had to go to Boston to the Democratic National Convention. That's when Barack Obama introduced himself to the world. And you and I actually were there together. We were there. And then we went to the Republican National Convention a few weeks later in New York. But that was the only reason why I stopped the Friday nights with my father. But I found out so much about him. I found out, number one, how much he adored his father. And I found out that my grandfather had, in the 1920s, had bought 160 acres of land. This is a black man who bought all of this land in the Mississippi Delta. He was incredibly ambitious. And I mean, I learned about myself through talking to him. And then I had those questions that I had to ask as a daughter. Why did you hurt my mother? What did you do on the night that Kim died? And there were questions that I had that I knew that, any journalist knows that when you have those really, those big questions, you save them for last, because those are the questions that could possibly torpedo the whole interview. And so I got a chance to ask my father everything I wanted to know. Wow. And that was invaluable.
Wow. That is really, you were doing it for yourself though, yes. Right? You weren't doing it to write a story for the paper or anything like that. No. You just wanted to know. So, we're running out of time, so I really want to talk about this for a little bit. Everyone knows that Kim had a troubled life, your sister, and she died. Mm-hmm. And we know the story of Deborah, of course. And the question I think many people will have is, you and Kim in particular grew up under the same roof, the same set of circumstances, everything. This book clearly is an exploration of how life emerged, right?
Right.
Kim paid a very harsh price for getting hooked on drugs and killing a man. You
Deborah.
like to...
Deborah paid the price.
I mean, Deborah. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Deborah, your friend. You like to quote scripture, and you say, "But by the grace of God go I." But certainly, it's much more complex than that,
Absolutely.
Don't you think, Dawn? It's all about making choices. And I wonder if there, in the course of your exploration of this and writing this memoir, did you come upon anything that helped you better understand how each of you arrived at different destinies?
Yeah, I don't know that we'll ever fully know. But I do feel like, because as I said, one of the motivating questions for me in the book was, when did we lose them? And the when happened at that critical time that everybody goes through, adolescence, when you have to make these choices. And at the same time, I don't think that what happened to them is based solely on them having made bad choices. I made bad choices too. We all make bad choices. We all make mistakes. And sometimes we are saved by a grace far bigger than ourselves. And sometimes it depends on the magnitude of the mistake. When Deborah took the gun with her, she was not intending to shoot anybody. There were a bunch of feral dogs in the area. And she thought she was Deborah has always been, she's like 5'1". I've always been at least 6 or 7, 8 inches taller than her. But she's always felt, like I can take care of myself. And so she took the gun with her, which was a mistake. And it went off. Even the judge said that he thought it was that she deserved a reckless homicide conviction as opposed to murder, but the jury felt differently. The things that my sister did, yes, we came from the same genetic, the same two parents, and we were just very different. But we were very different from the beginning. And so why they took the paths they did, I keep coming back to, it's, for a long time, and I'll put it this way, for a long time, I had to forgive myself
I was
for
wondering.
not being able to save them. And whether that's realistic, whether I could have or not, I felt like I should have been able to. But I also had to forgive them for making it so darn hard for all of us to save them. So I don't want to say that it's just about, they made bad choices. Well, we all make bad choices. And sometimes, the repercussions just aren't as dire. Right. And they had parents and people who were trying so hard. But so anyway, I don't know if that answers.
Right. It does. I mean, the answer is that we don't know, do we?
Right, we don't.
We don't know. So the question I think a lot of people would like to end with is, how is Deborah?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Deborah is excellent. Okay. And she went in there, when she committed a crime in Indiana, I thought, Indiana of all places, because Indiana is just it's a rough place in terms of criminal justice, and so but the women's prison system was just absolutely outstanding in terms of rehabilitation. The problem with our criminal justice system these days is that it's more of a warehousing as opposed to rehabilitating. But she was able to partake of all of she finished her bachelor's degree in prison, and it wasn't anything that was watered down. I mean, she had the same course load and professors as the people at the university that had the relationship with the prison, and she graduated with honors. Wow. And she was always a smart kid. Same with Kim, absolutely brilliant, both of them. And so she was able to begin the process of remaking herself in prison. So then when I picked her up in 2019, just before COVID, at the end of 2019, I picked her up. I was with her sister and her aunt. She was ready. The prison had helped her get her documents together so that she could get a driver's license. That's something that former inmates struggle with, just basic, your social security card. They helped her with housing. They helped her with employment. And so she was able to hit the ground running. And she did, and she hasn't looked back.
That is wonderful.
Yeah.
What a wonderful ending for a very touching memoir. Dawn, it was absolutely beautiful. It was just a pleasure to read. I hope you all enjoyed as much as I did.
Oh,
so.
Thank you. Thank you, friend. Yeah, thank you.